Hello and welcome back to our Constructing Villains series on Mortal Kombat as we take a look at probably the most used and abused jobber in all of Mortal Kombat, who at the same time remains really freaking cool and is one of those characters who has been absorbed to some degree into mainstream society through cultural osmosis and memes. That and a president with a similar first name. Today we'll be looking at the Tarkatan Baraka. I do kind of question the choice for his name, considering a creature without lips like he does would have a really hard time making a B sound, something that the developers for the Tarkatan language in Mortal Kombat 11 seem to realize, as it's mostly made up of noises that could be made without lips and with teeth like that. Fun little detail about how they handled the Tarkatans in 11. But Baraka's name sticks because that's what he fought under. And Baraka is one of the most memorable reoccurring characters in the series, despite his lack of an elevated position in the story. And probably his impact and his constant reappearances are the byproduct of him just looking so frickin' awesome. Now, Baraka did not initially emerge fully formed, and neither did the Tarkatans. Indeed, the name Tarkatan is something that appeared a little later. Originally, they were a half-demon people simply called the Nomads in Outworld. This would eventually be retconned in later Mortal Kombat games, making them their own separate race of a world that had been conquered by Shao Kahn's armies, with Baraka outright stating this to be the case in Mortal Kombat 10, or X. Similarly, Baraka didn't even start out as a monster at first. He was kind of imagined as a savage demon warrior named Rokuro, and early concept art had him depicted as something like a human ninja with hook swords. Now, the hook swords would appear as a part of Cabal later on, but most of these ideas were scrapped. And the real beginning of what would become Baraka came when several designers from the Mortal Kombat team bought a Nosferatu mask, which they repainted and made a little bit spookier with false fingernails for teeth. Also, there was the question of the character's range with those swords, so they ended up taking some inspiration from Wolverine and gave him blades that come out of his body. In this case, sword-like appendages that popped out of his forearms. Since a forearm could only conceivably hold so much of a blade, it solved the range issue. This would eventually lead to the ferocious warrior we recognize, and is a testament to the design team that they managed to create so memorable a monster. Indeed, Mortal Kombat has given us some of, I would have to say, the coolest monstrous races in all of gaming, starting with Goro and the Shokan. And the Tarkatans is their second outing into this field of monstrous beings from Outworld, holds up pretty well too. Now, not all of their forays into this went as well. I mean, my goodness, Draman needs some work. And oh goodness, Ferrator, our master blaster, without any real significant changes to make the character something unique other than, oh, they're symbiotes. But Mortal Kombat has managed to deliver with enough monsters to really fill out Outworld as an interesting place I'd like to explore in other games. That's why I'm sitting there going, Mortal Kombat RPG wouldn't be the worst idea. And not the least of which, because many of the races of Outworld actually kind of parallel mainstream fantasy races, which is something I want to bring up in relation to the Tarkatans because they fulfill an obvious role. The Tarkatans are basically the orcs of Mortal Kombat. Stop and think about it. Savage-style humanoids who get a whole lot of historically barbaric imagery associated with them. They eat intelligent beings. They're often mooks for evil overlords. And Baraka's basically served every evil overlord there is in Mortal Kombat, and then some. When evil overlords invade, they tend to send in an army of Tarkatans to do their dirty work, and he's always eager for a fight and bloodletting. So he fulfills the savage fighter archetypical villainous race. If you look at the Naknada introduced in Mortal Kombat 11, they're basically goblins with multiple arms. They're the slave species of a lot of Outworld, and much of Outworld's wealth is built upon their backs. But they also seem to be vicious, and the member that we get to meet is greedy and larcenous and rather goblin-y in all ways, shapes, or forms. Then, of course, you have the honorable, massive Shokan, who kind of inherit the honorable warrior race ethos, often seen in archetypical fantasy. If the Tarkatans are the Tolkienian orcs, the Shokan are the Blizzard orcs. You have the normal Outworlders, who are the everyman of Outworld, if you can call them that. People like, presumably, Bo Raicho and Li Mei. Then you have the High Folk, the Edanians, who are traditionally associated with nobility and magic. They're graceful, they're good-looking, and they tend towards the arrogant side. Many of them also having a tendency to defect to the good guys, as they were once a fairly noble people. But Tanya certainly displays them in all their evil glory, showing you the worst of their potential. This tie-in to mook species like the orcs and their role in fantasy storytelling is kind of driven home in even the costume designs for Baraka. Check out the new costumes in Mortal Kombat 11 and tell me that you don't think those things look like things the Isengard Uruk-hai would wear. They look like they come straight out of the Jackson Lord of the Rings film series. The helmets most of all. And Baraka's role in the story has largely been similar to that of high-ranking orc characters serving a greater evil overlord. He's introduced in Mortal Kombat 2 as someone who assaulted the Shaolin Temple in order to lure the monks to Outworld for vengeance. He is someone who crushes uprisings for Shao Kahn and devours his enemies. He serves one evil Dark Lord after another, including Shinnok and Quan Chi and Onaga. He also tends to be used as a jobber supreme, and many of his people are the hordes of monstrous humanoids who get thrown at the adversaries of the day and usually get slaughtered in droves. Throughout the Midway games, Baraka is largely treated as a mook known for his savagery, his ferociousness, and his desire to eat things. He's not very developed as a character other than as a person who serves others to vent his violent nature. All of his non-canonical endings that appear in the game's latter portion all reflect his savagery and the fact that he's basically been an abused slave of one evil lord or another throughout his whole life. Were it not for the fact that Tarkatans are carnivorous beings that will gladly eat other intelligent creatures, we could probably sympathize with that. It's in Mortal Kombat 9 and the sequels to follow that he starts to see some character shifts. In 9, we solidly set down that he is in fact a loyal servant of Shao Kahn due to the might makes right beliefs of the Tarkatans. And he extends that loyalty to Mileena. It appears that he lacks the ambition of some of his later Midway game counterparts in this version, seeking to lead his people and to serve another, primarily acting as a foot soldier and enforcer. In Mortal Kombat 10, his loyalty to Mileena remains, despite the revelation that she is in fact not the legitimate heir to the throne. He still considers his loyalty to Shao Kahn transferred to her, and the Tarkatans remain loyal to her even after his death, presumably out of some kinship with her or out of the fact that their leader was killed. It's a little bit unclear. For their continued support of Mileena, Kotal Khan erased them as a people, committed genocide on every last one, which brings us to Mortal Kombat 11, where we really start to see Baraka's character get developed. Like so many other orcs from so many different other works, there comes that time where the writers address them with more complexity and take them out of simply the evil mook role and try to make them more detailed three-dimensional beings. And Baraka, as their paragon figure and for a significant portion of time, one of the few Tarkatans we saw, gets more of this attention than others. Still, Baraka up to this point has been largely a one-note character. He is attacking someone ferociously like a beast and those cool hooked arms because he was directed to by an evil overlord. And even if he wins, he'll either kill that evil overlord or be betrayed by them. With, I think, one exception in Mortal Kombat 9, that's it. He's just the savage force to stop. Well, in Mortal Kombat 11, we see his horror at his people having been destroyed, which drives him to seek aid from Kronika after she revives him. He, quite understandably, does not like the fate of his people and is not willing to ally with the same creatures who murdered the Tarkatans in an act of vengeance. Sorry, Kotal Khan. Indeed, the destruction of the Tarkatans is one of the clearest signs that Kotal Khan is truly an unfit leader of Outworld. It is at this same time we finally get to see what the lifestyle of the Tarkatan people is and why Baraka may be what he is. Obviously, they are a nomadic people. Their tents and decorations are reminiscent of dark fantasy combined with the Mongols. They also have these massive cooking pits where they cook most often either intelligent beings or whatever beast they could catch. They don't seem to distinguish. And indeed, when you look at their teeth, it's clear they're carnivorous, perhaps even hyper-carnivorous, and probably would not be able to survive on a diet without meat. They'd probably do about as well on that as cats do with veganism. So there is a biological reason why they are so vicious, though they've developed an entire culture around it as well. There are sacred rituals relating to cannibalism, as demonstrated by the pre-combat banter in the fights that are not part of the main story, something that becomes a point of contention between him and Kitana. Their culture is also built around violence. Considering the might makes right ways of Outworld and the Tarkatan people, this would make some sense, and it would likely continue to breed a ferocious mindset. When you consider that Outworld is basically a survival of the fittest, where all of these people from different worlds who in no way, shape, or form had civilizations that were prepared to deal with each other and are intermixing animals in such a way that would make the catastrophic Colombian exchange look like playtime compared to the damage that these world mergings must do to the environment. And if you ever want to study the Colombian exchange and its ecological consequences, I look no further than diseases and, oh my goodness, the damage wrought by sheep. It's an interesting subject. So the Tarkatans have likely faced fierce competition in a land dominated largely by brigandry and something that is utterly lawless. So again, their mindset makes sense. They also seem to be low on the totem pole compared to larger species like the Shokan and the Centaurs, who in one game are cursed to be like Minotaurs, but okay. I'm not sure where they rank up compared to the other species. The Kaiten seem to want to live alone, and the bottom seems to be occupied by the peoples of the slave class, which seems to include a lot of Nakhnadans. So, despite the fact that we make the Tarkatans a bit more sympathetic because of their genocide and that whole scene where they're going to murder the women and children of the Tarkatans, they are still vicious, scary, and in line with the ideas we've had about them before. Thus, they aren't downgraded as a threat. And we also don't see Mortal Kombat 11's tendency to retcon things in this moment, as it fits naturally into what we already know about them and complicates them. The Tarkatans were previously a people of one hat who were just cannibals and just savages, but this game fleshed them out and did the same thing for Baraka as their primary representative and actual leader. This is a common thing in fiction when you have world building, especially when it involves many fictitious species. You'll often have one member of the species present, and we will define our early conceptions of the people by that character. And this generally turns out one of two ways. Either the character is a standout paragon of their people, and most of the rest of the populace we meet are like that character, or they're an exception to the rule and different from every other member of that society. And this is a part of that wider Planet of Hats trope that if you ever want to pop on TV Trips and take a look at, you can have some fun with. But if we spend enough time with that people, the simplistic, two-dimensional, hey, everyone in that group is the same, doesn't hold up, and they eventually get more complicated. And the same thing happens here to the Tarkatans. Baraka is still ferocious, still cannibalistic. He just also is motivated not just by selfishness and a desire for bloodshed, but a desire to protect his people, which he sees as synonymous with bloodshed. After all, the Tarkatans have survived by it, their rituals and customs involve it, thus this is not alien to him, and his behavior becomes natural, and even by Tarkatan moral standards, perhaps laudable. And his reasons for not enlisting with the main characters at first, and the difficulty of Kitana having to deal with him, are quite clear considering what future occurred in Outworld to his people. Why would he want to ally with Kotal Khan? But the chance for freedom and a equal say in what happens to Outworld is enough to tempt him into potentially testing this alliance out, causing him to side with the good guys against Shao Kahn and later Kronika, who, let's be honest, has no reason to keep any of her promises to anyone who's going to be eliminated in the new timeline. This new alliance and deeper Baraka character offer a lot of new story potential too, especially considering the sheer amount of cultural differences between the Tarkatans and the Edanians, Outworlders, and Shokan. And we see how tenuous the political situation is in the Aftermath DLC, where it doesn't take much for it to completely devolve into violence, demonstrating that Kitana's rule is not all that solid, and that trying to control these disparate peoples without simple sheer force is complicated, difficult, and perhaps even possibly doomed to failure. And we see signs of the potential story and social conflicts in the banter between Kitana and Baraka before their fights in the versus matches, which indicates that Kitana may start to ban certain Tarkatan practices, which will cause them to rebel. And this is actually a form of social strife that you see in multicultural societies, where you have traditions that simply cannot coexist and eventually lead to a breakdown in that society that leads to war. History is replete with so many examples of this that it's actually quite believable, and people hold on to their cultural and material traditions deeply and care about them very much. So yeah, I could see bloodshed happening over this, and that could just add more layers to the whole conflict in Outworld. Baraka, too, has additional motivations now to stand against or with people outside of just I want blood, removing him from being a one-note Tolkien-esque orc character to being someone who has his people's interests in mind, while at the same time being the ravenous monster we still know. And it incorporates a lot of the savage aspects of his species into his personality. A hyper-carnivore might actually be aggressive in some ways, though when you consider how aggressive prey animals are in real life, this is hardly unique to carnivores. But he has more complex reasons to perhaps struggle with characters, and I think this is reflected in some of his Outworld banter with Shiva, with Kitana, with Shao Kahn, and other characters who were involved in that political situation, as we see his desire for freedom, desire to protect his people and their traditions, but all of these desires can cause him to come into conflict, and conflict is the heart of many stories to come. And the fact that he's no longer trapped in one note gives him a lot more narrative viability. And he can still take up that old note when he needs to serve as a simple adversary. But we can now do so much more, and it increases the narrative complexity of the character, changing Baraka from a mere mook to someone who matters in the story on a human level. And despite some of Mortal Kombat 11's mishandling of characters and stories, I feel that they did pretty well by Baraka. Except for, of course, the rewrite that makes all of his character development and detail utterly meaningless, but that's my problem with the Mortal Kombat 11 ending. Baraka is also a great example of how culturally adjacent ideas can be adapted into something unique. I mean, you have a lot of people go, well, nothing's original anymore, but ideas don't come out of nowhere. They are influenced by other things around them. They develop based on what a person knows, sees, and I find some of the best original creations are, in fact, innovations on what already exists. Are the Tarkatans similar to Tolkien orcs? Of course, but they are really something that belongs in Mortal Kombat. They're spikier, they're more savage, and oh look, they love cannibalism, and let's face it, what they could do to the human body really requires a pretty hard rating. That is not something you could show in a Peter Jackson film. Are their arm blades kinda like Wolverine? Yes, but they're also something unique, organically grown blades. And indeed, the abilities of Baraka and 11 indicate they might be able to sprout and shoot bone growths in other areas, but this doesn't seem like a copycat of, say, Spike or Marrow. It takes a form memorable and linkable to the Tarkatans. Pop culture fiction is full of creatures with more teeth than the Osmond family, but the Tarkatans still manage to look unique. Adopting our understanding of teeth equals danger and putting it in a new pattern in a placement that we would recognize and find unsettling, but still awesome. And the original Baraka was done pretty cheaply, demonstrating how budget, form, and technology all help shape the design of the creatures you have available to you. The way their culture has become more apparent and moved beyond the simple villainy of Baraka has also demonstrated how stories can and should evolve while still being loyal to the source material. And I think that that's a lesson that Mortal Kombat would be well served to learn from. Evolve like Baraka. Don't suddenly shift and change like Sindel. They successfully elevated a character that was a cool mook and jobber, who was still largely not that significant to the story, to someone that Outworld's politics turn on and who has deeper motivations while still being what we recognize. This is solid characterization and development at work. And that is the real narrative and game design lesson we can learn from Baraka. That, and one other important thing. In visual media, visuals are important. Was there much that made Baraka stand out compared to other characters besides his appearance? Not really, but a solid character appearance can make someone stick out in people's minds enough to see them become popular to improve, especially in a piece of media where all of the characters are bare bones. This is why a character in a single still of a comic can become so memorable that people have to pick that character up again and do something with them. Visuals matter too. Well, I'm getting out of here before the Tarkatans start to get hungry. Toodles.